The warning lights flashed red across the command center as another message came through the broken radio system. Commander Una Park stared at her screen, watching another star system disappear from the map. 3 more worlds had fallen to the HFY Empire in just one day. Her heart sank as she realized the terrible truth. Bastille Prime was now the last free world left. The HFY were like a disease spreading across space. For 300 years, they had conquered every planet. They touched. No one had ever beaten them, not once. They moved like machines, destroying everything in their path without mercy or hesitation. Una had spent months studying their battle records, looking for any weakness, any mistake. She found nothing but perfect victories built on mountains of bones. Lieutenant Minho Choi ran up to her station, sweat dripping from his face despite the cool air in the bunker. His uniform was dirty from helping load the evacuation ships, but his voice stayed calm, even though his eyes showed the fear they all felt. "Commander, the last civilian transport just left the planet," he reported, trying to sound professional. "We got most of the families out safely. Only a few hundred people refused to leave." Una nodded slowly. At least the children would live to see another day, even if their home world wouldn't. Through the thick metal walls, she could hear the distant rumble of enemy ships entering their solar system. The HFY scouts moved like hungry wolves, circling their prey before the main pack arrived for the kill. She had read every report about HFY tactics. They always followed the same pattern. First, the scout ships would map out all the defenses. Then massive war fleets would arrive and surround the planet completely. After that came the bombardment from space, turning cities into rubble and forests into ash. Finally, millions of HFY soldiers would land and hunt down any survivors hiding in the ruins. It had worked on every single world they had ever attacked. Una's people had maybe 2 days before the main fleet arrived. 2 days to somehow find a miracle. Her fingers shook as she reached for the long-range communication device. A few days ago, some refugees from the outer colonies had told strange stories. They spoke about rumors of a new species somewhere far away in something called the Sol System. These creatures called themselves humans and apparently had their own military forces. Most people laughed at such stories. After all, if these humans were real and actually dangerous, wouldn't the HFY have conquered them already? But Una was desperate enough to try anything. When you're about to die anyway, even the craziest plan seems worth attempting. She pulled up the star charts and found the coordinates the refugees had mentioned. Her hands moved quickly across the control panel, setting up a transmission that would travel faster than light across the galaxy. The message would include everything: their location, their situation, tactical data about HFY forces, and a desperate plea for military help. "What are you sending, Commander?" Minho asked quietly. "A prayer," she whispered back. "I'm asking complete strangers to come die with us." The transmission system hummed to life, charging up for the long-distance broadcast. Una typed her message in simple galactic standard language, hoping these mysterious humans could understand it. She included detailed information about HFY weapons, ship designs, and battle tactics. If anyone was going to help them, they would need to know exactly what they were fighting against. The machine beeped, ready to send. Una took a deep breath and pressed the button. Her message shot out into the darkness of space, racing toward a distant star system she had never seen. She watched the transmission status until it confirmed the signal had entered hyperspace and was on its way. Now came the hardest part: waiting. Either no one would receive the message, or they would receive it and decide that helping a doomed world wasn't worth the cost. Both outcomes meant death for everyone still on Bastille Prime. As Una stared out at the stars, she wondered what these humans were like. Were they warriors or peaceful farmers? Did they even have weapons that could hurt HFY ships? Would they understand that an entire civilization was about to be wiped out forever? The enemy scouts grew brighter in the night sky, and time was running out. The message arrived at Lunar Base at exactly 0347 hours, waking up the night shift communications officer with its urgent priority codes. Within minutes, the alien distress signal was racing through military channels, finally landing on General Sumin Kim's desk as she drank her morning coffee and watched Earth rise over the lunar horizon. She had read the message 3 times now, And it still seemed impossible. An entire civilization was begging for help against something called the HFY Empire. The attached files contained battle footage that made her stomach turn, massive alien ships reducing cities to smoking. Craters, while millions of people tried to flee. The tactical data painted a picture of an enemy that had never lost a single war in 3 centuries. General Sumin rubbed her tired eyes and called an emergency meeting. Within an hour, the top military leaders of Earth were gathered around the conference table in the secure briefing room. The holographic display showed star maps with red zones marking HFY territory, a growing cancer that had already swallowed over 200 worlds. Admiral Hyunwoo Lee leaned back in his chair, shaking his head as he reviewed the numbers. His weathered face showed the skepticism that came from 40 years of military service. These aliens want us to fight an empire that outnumbers them 50 to 1. They're asking us to commit suicide for people we've never met. Colonel Jae-hyun. Ahn pulled up more tactical displays, highlighting the size of HFY fleets. Look at these ship counts, General. They have thousands of warships, millions of soldiers. Our entire space navy has maybe 100 combat vessels. We'd be throwing our people into a meat grinder. The room fell quiet as everyone studied the data. Earth had been watching the HFY expansion for months through long-range sensors and intercepted communications. So far, the alien empire hadn't noticed humanity's small corner of the galaxy, and most Earth leaders wanted to keep it that way. Why invite trouble by getting involved in someone else's war? But General Sumin had noticed something the others missed. She stood up and walked to the holographic display, pausing the battle footage at a specific moment. The scene showed HFY ground forces retreating from a burning city after what looked like a successful attack. "Watch this part carefully," she said, pointing at the alien soldiers. The HFY had just taken this city, but they pulled back. After losing about 12% of their assault force, that's not normal behavior for conquerors. Admiral Lee frowned. Maybe they were regrouping for another attack. No, look at the pattern. Sumin pulled up more battle recordings. It happens in every engagement. The HFY fight with incredible precision and overwhelming force, but the moment their casualties reach a certain threshold, they retreat and call for reinforcements. They're not used to taking heavy losses. Colonel Ahn studied the footage more carefully. "You think they're not as tough as they appear?" "I think they're bullies," Sumin said quietly. "They've spent 300 years fighting civilizations that surrender after the first big defeat. They've never faced an enemy that keeps fighting no matter what the cost." The debate that followed was heated and lasted for hours. Some officers argued that getting involved would only bring the HFY to Earth sooner. Others worried about the moral implications of ignoring a genocide. A few suggested sending supplies instead of soldiers, but General Sumin kept coming. Back to those battle recordings. The HFY were efficient killers, but they fought like soldiers who expected to go home to their families. They used overwhelming force to minimize their own casualties. What would happen if they faced an enemy that didn't care about the odds? "I want to send 1 regiment," she finally announced. "The 3rd Expeditionary Marines, 800 of our best soldiers." The room erupted in protests. Admiral Lee stood up, his face red with anger. "You want to sacrifice 800 Marines based on a hunch about alien psychology?" "If I'm wrong, we lose 800 good soldiers," Sumin admitted. "But if I'm right, we might just teach the entire galaxy something important about human warfare. We might show them that sometimes the side that refuses to quit can beat impossible odds." The vote was close, closer than it had any right to be. But when the final count was tallied, Sumin's proposal had passed by just 1 vote. As the meeting broke up and officers hurried away to make preparations, she picked up her secure phone and dialed a number she knew by heart. Colonel Do-hyun Park answered on the 2nd ring from Camp Pendleton in California. His voice was alert despite the early hour. Marines were used to being woken up by urgent calls. "Do-hyun, how quickly can you get the 3rd Regiment ready for deep space deployment?" she asked without preamble. There was a pause. "How deep are we talking, General?" "Deep enough that we might not come back." Another pause, longer this time. "Give me 72 hours, ma'am. My Marines will be ready." The assault carrier. Relentless shuddered as it dropped out of hyperspace, its hull groaning from the sudden transition back to normal space. Colonel Do-Yun Park gripped the bridge railing and stared at the nightmare unfolding on the main screen. Bastille Prime hung in space like a wounded animal, its surface covered in fires that could be seen from orbit. Massive Kethvar battleships surrounded the planet in a perfect formation, their weapons sending streams of deadly energy down to the cities below. It was worse than the reports had described. The Coalition fleet was scattered and running for their lives. Several burning ships drifted past the Relentless, their crews either dead or evacuated. The enemy had turned this into a slaughter, not a battle. Major Suna Jang looked up from her tactical station, her face pale as she counted the enemy ships. "Colonel, I'm reading 47 Kethvar vessels in the immediate area. Their fighters are already moving to intercept us." Do-Yun could see the enemy fighter craft swarming toward them like angry wasps. Each one was twice the size of a human fighter, and there were hundreds of them. The logical thing to do would be to retreat, call for reinforcements, maybe try to rescue some Coalition survivors, but logic wasn't why they had come here. "How long until the drop pods are ready?" he asked, his voice cutting through the nervous chatter on the bridge. 60 seconds, sir," replied the launch officer. "But, Colonel, those fighters will tear us apart before we reach the surface." Do-Hyun smiled grimly. The Kethvar had probably never seen human drop tactics before. They were about to get an education. "Launch all pods. Now, full combat drop." The Relentless shook as 800 armored pods shot out from its belly like bullets from a giant gun. Each pod contained one Marine with enough weapons and supplies to fight for days. The pods were designed to punch through enemy defenses and get soldiers to the ground fast, even if it meant crashing through anything in their way. The Kethvar. Fighters tried to intercept them, but the pods were moving too fast and there were too many of them. Some fighters managed to destroy a few pods, but most of the Marines made it through the enemy screen. Do-Yun's pod slammed into the ground near the capital city with enough force to crack the pavement. He kicked open the door and rolled out, rifle in hand, just as explosions began lighting up the sky around him. The scene on the ground was chaos. Coalition soldiers were running in every direction, some carrying wounded comrades, others just trying to find somewhere safe to hide. Buildings were collapsing from the orbital bombardment, and the air was thick with smoke and dust. Lieutenant Kyung-hee Nam sprinted over to Do-Hyun's position, dodging falling debris as she ran. Her uniform was already dirty, and there was blood on her helmet from a close explosion. "Sir, I've got contact with most of our platoons. We lost maybe 30 Marines in the drop, but the rest are setting up defensive positions around the shield generators." Do-Hyun nodded and activated his radio, calling out to his scattered forces. "All units, this is Hammer 6. Establish perimeter around the power station. Dig in deep and prepare for company." A Coalition officer stumbled toward them, his eyes wide with panic. His alien features were hard to read, but his body language screamed fear. "Human Commander, our forces are retreating to the mountains. The enemy ground assault will begin soon. You should evacuate while you still can." Lieutenant Nam looked at her colonel, waiting for orders. Through his binoculars, Do-Hyun could see dust clouds on the horizon where Kethvar armored vehicles were, forming up for their attack. Intelligence reports said they had enough troops to overwhelm the planet 10 times over. "Tell the Coalition forces they can retreat if they want," Do-Hyun said calmly, checking his rifle and adjusting his gear. "But we're staying right here." "Sir, what should I tell them our mission is?" Nam asked. Do-Hyun looked toward the approaching enemy forces, then at the Coalition soldiers still running past them in panic. His Marines were already digging foxholes and setting up machine gun positions, working with the calm efficiency of professionals who knew their job. "Tell them we're buying them time," he said simply, "however long it takes." The first Kethvar artillery shells began falling 20 minutes later, exploding in massive fireballs that shook the ground and shattered windows for miles around. But the Marines didn't run. They just dug deeper and waited for the enemy to come close enough to fight. What happened next would be talked about across the galaxy for generations, the day 800 humans decided to make their stand against impossible odds and change the course of galactic history forever. War Prime Gorak stared at the holographic battle map, his clawed fingers tapping nervously against the command console. The red dots representing his forces should have swept across the battlefield hours ago, overwhelming the tiny cluster of blue dots that marked human positions. Instead, the blue dots remained exactly where they had started, while thousands of his red dots had simply vanished. 6 hours of continuous assault, and his army had moved less than 2 kilometers. In 300 years of conquest, nothing like this had ever happened to the HFY Empire. 50,000 of his best soldiers should have crushed 800 primitives in minutes, not hours. Yet somehow, these humans were still fighting. Sub-Commander Vex approached the tactical station, his usually confident posture replaced by obvious confusion. His armor showed scorch marks from getting too close to the front lines, and his voice carried a tone Gorak had never heard before, uncertainty mixed with something that almost sounded like fear. War Prime. The humans are not following standard military doctrine, Vex reported carefully. When we surround their positions, they do not surrender. When we cut off their supply lines, they continue fighting with whatever they have left. When we offer them the chance to retreat, they ignore us completely, Gorak growled in frustration. Every species they had ever conquered understood basic survival instincts. When facing overwhelming odds, intelligent beings surrendered to save their lives. When wounded beyond the ability to fight effectively, soldiers withdrew to medical stations. When ammunition ran low, units retreated to resupply. These were universal constants of warfare. "Show me the frontline feeds," he commanded. The main display switched to live video from his forward assault units. What Gorak saw made no sense according to everything he knew about combat. A human soldier with blood streaming down his face continued operating a heavy machine gun, even though shrapnel had clearly damaged his left arm. When HFY troops flanked his position, the humans simply turned the weapon around and kept firing until enemy soldiers were forced to take cover. Another camera showed a female human who had been defending a concrete bunker for over 3 hours. She was alone now. Her squad mates had been killed or wounded, but she kept shooting at advancing HFY troops with just a small sidearm and homemade explosives. Intelligence reports said she should have run out of ammunition an hour ago, yet she was still fighting. The most disturbing footage came from Sector 7, where a group of humans had been completely surrounded. Instead of surrendering, they had called for their own artillery to fire directly on their position. The bombardment killed most of the HFY assault force, along with several of the humans, but the survivors immediately resumed fighting from the crater the shells had created. "This is not possible," Gorak muttered, switching between different camera feeds. "Look at this one. That human has lost his left leg below the knee, but he's crawling back to his fighting position instead of seeking medical attention." Sub-Commander Vex leaned closer to the display. "War Prime, some of our soldiers are reporting that the humans sing during battle. Even while under heavy bombardment, they make noise that sounds like celebration." Gorak had studied the military tactics of hundreds of species. Some fought fiercely to protect their homes. Others used clever strategies to overcome superior numbers. A few species were naturally aggressive and enjoyed combat. But he had never encountered anything like this. Soldiers who seemed to view their own death as acceptable as long as they could hurt the enemy. The casualty reports kept streaming in. 20,000 HFY soldiers dead or wounded, equipment losses mounting, medical stations overwhelmed, and still the humans held their positions and kept fighting. "Double the assault forces," Gorak ordered, though his voice lacked its usual confidence. "Send in the heavy armor divisions. Increase the artillery bombardment. These primitives will break eventually." But even as he gave the orders, something cold settled in his stomach. For the first time in his military career, War Prime Gorak was beginning to understand what his ancestors might have felt before the HFY became an empire. The terrible realization that the enemy might not fight according to the rules you understood. The humans weren't just refusing to retreat. They were fighting like creatures who had already accepted death and decided to make it as expensive as possible for their enemies. And that, Gorak was beginning to realize, might be the most dangerous kind of enemy in the universe. Sergeant Siongrio wiped the sweat and dirt from his face as he counted the bullets left in his magazine. 12 rounds. That was all he had between his squad and the hundreds of Kethvar soldiers marching up Hill 247. For 3 straight days, they had been fighting without sleep, without rest, without any hope of reinforcement. What started as a platoon of 30 Marines was now just 8 exhausted, wounded soldiers holding a pile of rocks that had somehow become the most important place in the galaxy. The hill didn't look like much, just a small rise covered with broken concrete and twisted metal from destroyed buildings. But it overlooked the main road to the capital city, and as long as humans held it, the Kethvar couldn't move their heavy equipment forward. So for 72 hours straight, wave after wave of enemy troops had tried to take it, and every time, the Marines had thrown them back. Corporal Minji Han crawled over from what used to be a machine gun nest, but was now just a crater filled with sandbags and empty ammunition boxes. Her left arm was wrapped in a bloody bandage, and there were dark circles under her eyes that made her look 10 years older than when they first landed. "Sarge, I've got maybe 200 rounds left for the big gun," she reported, her voice hoarse, from shouting orders over the constant noise of battle. "After that, we're down to rifles and grenades." Shungri nodded and looked through his binoculars at the enemy formation, approaching from the valley below. This wave was bigger than the others, maybe 1,000 troops with armored vehicles and heavy weapons. The Kethvar had finally decided to stop playing games and crush the human position with overwhelming force. "Contact base," he told his radio operator, Private Jin-hyuk Kim. "Tell them we need fire support right on top of our position." Jin-hyuk's eyes went wide. "Sarge, that's danger close. The shells will land right on us." "I know what danger close means, kid." Shungri activated his own radio and switched to the command frequency. "Foxtrot 6, this is Foxtrot 2. We're about to be overrun. Request immediate fire mission on Hill 247. The voice that came back belonged to Colonel Do-hyun Park himself, calling from the main command post 5 kilometers away. "Negative, Foxtrot 2. That's danger close to your position. Find another." "Solution." Shungri looked at his remaining Marines, 8 soldiers against 1,000, with almost no ammunition left and nowhere to retreat. Corporal Han was setting up the machine gun for what would probably be its last fight. Private Kim was distributing the final grenades. The others were checking their rifles and fixing their bayonets for close combat. "Sir, with all due respect," Shungri said into the radio, "we're going to hold this hill or die on it. Those are the only 2 options. If you want us to hold it, we need those shells right now." There was silence on the radio for what felt like forever. Then Colonel Park's voice came back, quieter than before. "Understood, Foxtrot 2. Fire mission approved. Take cover." 3 minutes later, the artillery shells came screaming down from the sky like thunder. The explosions were so close that dirt and rocks rained down on the Marines huddled in their foxholes. The ground shook so hard that Shungri thought his teeth might fall out. Through the smoke and dust, he could hear the screams of Kethvar soldiers, caught in the bombardment. When the noise finally stopped and the smoke began to clear, Shungri raised his head carefully. The entire front slope of the hill was covered with craters and debris. Most of the attacking Kethvar force had been destroyed, and the survivors were running back down the valley in panic. "Sound off," he yelled. "Who's still alive?" One by one, voices answered from different positions around the hill. Corporal Han was wounded but still fighting. Private Kim had a concussion but could still operate the radio. 3 other Marines were hurt but mobile. That left 5 soldiers still capable of fighting. From her observation post in the city, Coalition Commander Yuna Park watched the human positions through powerful binoculars. She had been monitoring their radio traffic for days, listening to conversations that defied everything she understood about warfare. These soldiers talked about holding positions that couldn't be held, fighting battles that couldn't be won, and making sacrifices that made no logical sense, yet somehow they kept winning. Every time the Kethvar attacked, the humans found a way to throw them back. They used tactics that bordered on insanity, but those tactics worked because they created psychological effects the enemy had never experienced before. As she watched Sergeant O's squad prepare for the next assault, Yuna began to understand something important about human warfare. These soldiers weren't just fighting to win, they were fighting to show the enemy that some things were worth dying for. Sub-Commander Vex sat in his private quarters, staring at the medical report he had never thought he would need to write. His hands shook slightly as he typed the words combat exhaustion, a term that didn't even exist in the HFY military vocabulary until 3 days ago. For a species that had conquered 200 worlds without losing a single campaign, the concept of soldiers becoming too mentally damaged to fight was completely foreign. But here he was, requesting medical leave because he couldn't sleep, couldn't eat, and jumped at every unexpected sound. The nightmares were the worst part. Images of human soldiers who kept fighting even when they should have been dead, of positions that never fell no matter how many troops he threw at them, of enemies who laughed while bleeding out on the battlefield. The door chimed, and War Prime Gorak entered without waiting for permission. The Supreme Commander looked as tired as Vex felt, his usually perfect uniform wrinkled, and his eyes showing the same haunted expression that had become common among the officer corps. "Report," Gorak commanded, though his voice lacked its usual authority. Vex pulled up the casualty statistics on his wall display. The numbers were so bad that he had checked them 3 times before believing them. "Sir, we've lost 60% of our ground forces. Medical stations are overwhelmed, not just with physical injuries, but with soldiers suffering from what the human databases call post-traumatic stress." Gorak studied the medical reports with growing disbelief. HFY soldiers were experiencing panic attacks, refusing to advance on human positions, and in some cases, shooting at their own troops by mistake. These were symptoms of mental breakdown that had never appeared in 3 centuries of warfare. "Explain how 800 primitives have caused this," Gorak demanded. Vex activated a series of battlefield recordings that had been haunting his dreams. "Sir, they're not just killing our soldiers. They're destroying their minds. Look at this footage from yesterday's assault on Hill 247. The recording showed a human soldier with massive wounds to his chest and legs, but instead of falling down, he continued firing a machine gun at advancing HFY troops. When the weapon ran out of ammunition, the human pulled out grenades and kept fighting. Even when mortally wounded, he crawled toward enemy positions with a knife in his hand. This is not normal behavior," Vex continued, switching to another recording. "Here's a human female who held a bunker alone for 6 hours. She was surrounded, outgunned, and had no hope of survival. But she kept fighting and even taunted our soldiers over the radio, telling them they would have to come and take the position." From her dead body, Gorak watched footage that showed human soldiers singing songs while under heavy artillery bombardment, sharing their last food with wounded comrades instead of saving it for themselves and calling down fire on their own positions rather than surrender. These actions violated every principle of military logic and self-preservation that the HFY understood. "My troops are afraid, War Prime," Vex admitted quietly. "They've never faced an enemy that treats death as an acceptable outcome. Our soldiers fight to win and go home to their families. Humans fight like they've already said goodbye to their families and accepted that they're going to die. That psychological difference is breaking our forces." The casualty ratios told the story. In cold numbers. In normal warfare, attacking forces expected to lose about 3 soldiers for every defender they killed. Against human positions, the HFY were losing 40 soldiers for every human death. The mathematics of conquest had been turned upside down. "Perhaps," Vex said carefully, "we should consider opening negotiations with these humans." Gorak's response was automatic. The HFY Empire does not negotiate with primitive species. But even as he said the words, his conviction wavered. For the first time in his long military career, he found himself dreading the next battle report. Meanwhile, across the sector, coalition forces were witnessing something they had never seen before. Human ships appeared out of nowhere to attack. HFY supply convoys, striking with suicidal fury before disappearing into hyperspace. Human special forces conducted raids deep behind enemy lines, targeting objectives that should have been impossible to reach. And everywhere there was that maddening human refusal to acknowledge when a battle was lost. The psychological warfare was working both ways. While HFY forces were learning to fear human unpredictability, coalition troops were beginning to believe that maybe, just maybe, the impossible could happen. Maybe an empire that had never lost could finally be beaten by soldiers who simply refused to accept defeat. Admiral Yunseo Park's flagship dropped out of hyperspace, expecting to find a celebration. The Bastille system should have been under complete HFY control by now, with War Prime Gorak's forces busy loading prisoners and securing valuable resources. Instead, her sensors immediately detected something that made her blood run cold. Massive energy signatures from ongoing ground battles and casualty beacon signals scattered across the planet's surface. She strode onto the bridge of her command ship, her polished boots clicking against the metal deck plates. 300 years of HFY military tradition had taught her that campaigns like this should be over in days, not weeks. Yet here she was, arriving to what looked like a full-scale war instead of a cleanup operation. "Get me War Prime Gorak. Immediately," she ordered her communications officer. When Gorak's image appeared on the main screen, Admiral Park barely recognized him. The confident military commander she had known for decades looked exhausted and defeated. His usually perfect uniform was stained with dust, and there were dark circles under his eyes that spoke of too many sleepless nights. "Admiral," Gorak began, his voice lacking its usual strength, "the situation is complicated." Complicated? Park's voice rose dangerously. "My sensors show that your ground assault has been stalled for over a week. Your casualty reports indicate losses exceeding 40%. Explain this disaster immediately." Gorak hesitated, searching for words to describe something that shouldn't have been possible. "The humans, Admiral. They fight unlike any species we have ever encountered. Our standard battle tactics, which have worked on 200 worlds, are completely ineffective against them." Admiral Park studied the tactical displays, showing HFY positions barely advanced from their original landing zones. Red markers indicated thousands of casualties, while the tiny cluster of blue dots representing human forces remained stubbornly in place. "You are telling me that our entire offensive, 50,000 of the Empire's finest troops, supported by orbital bombardment and advanced weaponry, has been stopped by less than 1,000 primitive soldiers?" Before Gorak could answer, alarms began blaring throughout the bridge. The fleet intelligence officer, a young HFY named Thek, rushed to his station with obvious panic in his movements. "Admiral, long-range sensors are detecting multiple hyperspace signatures," Thek reported, his voice cracking with stress. "Human fleet formations are jumping into systems throughout the sector." Admiral Park moved to the tactical display, watching in growing horror as red warning icons began appearing across what had been secure HFY territory. These weren't random attacks or desperate counterstrikes. The pattern showed careful coordination and strategic planning. "Ma'am, we're receiving emergency transmissions from 17 different systems," Thek continued, his hands shaking as he processed the incoming data. "Human forces are striking supply convoys, attacking fuel depots, and conducting raids on command centers. Our entire logistics network is under assault." Park stared at the display in disbelief. The humans weren't just defending Bastille Prime. They were conducting a full military campaign across multiple star systems simultaneously. This level of coordination required massive resources, detailed intelligence, and military capabilities that their initial assessments had completely missed. "How many human ships are we talking about?" she demanded. "At least 50 major vessels, possibly more," Thek replied. "They're using hit-and-run tactics, striking hard and fast before disappearing into hyperspace. Our response fleets keep arriving to find empty space and destroyed installations." The implications hit Admiral Park like a physical blow. The humans hadn't sent 800 Marines to make a heroic last stand. They had sent them as the first wave of a coordinated military operation designed to drag the HFY Empire into a prolonged war. Every day the ground forces remained pinned down on Bastille Prime was another day for human fleets to tear apart HFY supply lines across the sector. "Admiral," War Prime Gorak's voice came through the speakers, sounding hollow and defeated. "I don't think these humans are the primitive species we believe them to be. They're fighting a war we don't understand, using tactics our military doctrine never prepared us for." Park looked at the tactical display again, watching human forces continue their relentless attacks across dozens of star systems. For the first time in 3 centuries, the HFY Empire was not winning a war. They were losing it, and losing it badly, to an enemy that seemed to view impossible odds as merely another challenge to overcome. The tide had turned, and Admiral Park was beginning to understand that the humans had been planning for this moment. Long before that first desperate message had ever been sent from Bastille Prime, General Soo-min Kim watched through the massive viewing ports of the carrier Indomitable as hundreds of landing craft descended toward Bastille Prime like a swarm of metal insects. The planet's surface was scarred with 3 months of continuous warfare, but for the first time since the campaign began, human forces were moving forward instead of just holding their ground. 15,000 Marines from the 1st Division were now on the planet, and the difference was immediately obvious. What had started as a desperate last stand by 800 soldiers had transformed into a full-scale military offensive. The tactical displays showed blue arrows pushing deep into what had been Kethva-controlled territory. "General, Colonel Park is reporting from the front lines," announced Lieutenant Jiwon Choi from the communications station. Colonel Do-hyun Park's voice crackled through the speakers, mixed with the distant sound of gunfire and explosions. "General, Kim, resistance is collapsing across all sectors. The Kethva are pulling back to fortified positions, but they're avoiding direct contact with our advance units. It's like they're afraid to get close to us." Soo-min studied the real-time battle feeds on her tactical screen. 3 months of brutal combat had changed both armies in fundamental ways. The humans had learned how Kethva forces operated, their formations, their weapons, their standard responses to different situations. More importantly, they had adapted their own tactics to exploit every weakness they discovered. But the Kethva had learned something too, and it was destroying their effectiveness as a fighting force. They had learned to fear human unpredictability. They had seen too many battles where human soldiers did impossible things, made sacrifices that defied logic, and refused to accept defeat even when facing certain death. That knowledge was eating away at their confidence like acid. Captain Hanbin Ko approached with a data pad containing the latest intelligence reports. "Ma'am, Admiral Lee's fleet is reporting successful strikes on 3 more Kethva supply depots in the outer system. The enemy commander is requesting permission to evacuate their forward operating bases." Soo-min didn't hesitate. "Request denied. We don't retreat, and we're not going to let them retreat either. Signal all units to push the advance." The order went out across the human fleet, and within minutes reports began flowing in from strike teams, hitting Kethva positions throughout the star system. This wasn't just about winning the battle for Bastille Prime anymore. It was about proving to the entire galaxy that the Kethva Empire could be beaten. Down on the planet's surface, Sergeant Seungri-oh moved carefully through the ruins of what had been the enemy's primary command center. The promotion to company commander had come after his original officers were killed or wounded, leaving him in charge of 60 Marines who had somehow survived 3 months of hell. The Kethva had built their base inside a series of connected buildings, creating a fortress that should have been nearly impossible to assault. But human engineers had found a way to collapse the main support structure, and human infantry had poured through the gaps before the defenders could reorganize. "Sarge, we've got movement in the north building," reported Corporal Minji Han, who had somehow managed to keep both her machine gun and her sense of humor intact, despite everything they had been through. Seungri raised his hand to signal for a halt, then used his binoculars to study the enemy position. Through the broken windows, he could see Kethva soldiers moving with careful, deliberate motions. They were skilled fighters. There was no question about that. Their equipment was excellent, their tactics were sound, and their discipline was impressive. But there was something different about the way they fought now. They moved like soldiers who expected to go home to their families when the war was over. They took careful cover, conserved ammunition, and retreated when taking heavy casualties. These were all smart, professional military decisions. The humans, on the other hand, had learned to fight like soldiers who had already written their last letters home. They advanced through enemy fire because the mission was more important than personal safety. They shared their last food and ammunition with wounded comrades because leaving someone behind was unacceptable. They called for danger-close artillery strikes because sometimes winning required accepting terrible risks. "Move up," Seungri ordered his Marines. "Standard assault formation. No prisoners unless they surrender, and we don't stop until we reach the far side of the complex. As his company advanced through the ruins, Seungri realized that they weren't just fighting for Bastille Prime anymore. They were fighting to show the galaxy that some things were worth dying for, and that sometimes the side that refused to quit could defeat enemies that seemed impossible to beat. The HFY Empire was learning a lesson that would echo across the stars for generations. Never underestimate an enemy that has already decided the mission is more important than survival. 6 months had passed since that desperate message first traveled through hyperspace from a dying world to an unknown species in the Sol system. Now War Prime Gorak sat in a clean conference room on Bastille Prime, staring across a polished table at the human who had changed the course of galactic history. The contrast was almost surreal, the sterile diplomatic environment versus the memories of brutal warfare that had brought them to this moment. Colonel Do-hyun Park looked older than he had when the war started. New scars crossed his face, and his beard had gone grey at the edges. His uniform was crisp and clean, but Gorak could see the weight of command in his eyes, the look of a soldier who had made impossible decisions and lived with the consequences. "Your species is unusual," Gorak said carefully, his electronic translator working overtime to convert thoughts that didn't quite exist in his language. "In 300 years of expansion, we have conquered over 200 worlds. We have faced fierce warriors, clever tacticians, and desperate defenders, but never have we encountered resistance like yours." Do-hyun leaned back in his chair, a slight smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "You fight to win territory and expand your empire. We fight because it's what we do. There's a fundamental difference in motivation." The ceasefire agreement they were signing was the first of its kind in HFY military history. For 3 centuries, the Empire had known only total victory or total defeat, usually total victory. The concept of negotiating with an enemy who remained undefeated was so foreign that their military doctrine had no protocols for it. The formal document established new territorial boundaries, prisoner exchange procedures, and communication protocols between the two species. But more importantly, it officially recognized humanity as a legitimate military power that could no longer be ignored or dismissed as primitive. The galaxy's balance of power had shifted forever. 3 days later, General May, Soomin Kim stood before the Joint Coalition Council in their Grand Assembly Hall. Representatives from dozens of worlds filled the chamber, many of them species who had been preparing for their own desperate last stands against HFY expansion. Her words would be broadcast across the galaxy, reaching billions of beings who had lived in fear of the Empire's seemingly unstoppable advance. "The HFY Empire built their success on a simple assumption," she began, her voice carrying clearly through the vast chamber. "They believed that all intelligent species share their concept of acceptable losses. They thought that every civilization would eventually choose survival over resistance when faced with overwhelming odds." She paused, looking out at the assembled delegates who represented worlds that had been written off as doomed just months earlier. "They were wrong," she continued. "Sometimes the species that refuses to quit, regardless of the odds stacked against them, gets to write the final chapter of the story." Within a year, 17 coalition worlds had submitted formal requests for human military advisors. The galaxy had learned an important lesson. Victory didn't always belong to the side with the largest fleet, the most advanced technology, or the greatest numbers. Sometimes it belonged to those who simply would not accept defeat, no matter what the cost. Commander Yuna Park, who now served as the Coalition's official liaison to Earth, often found herself thinking about that desperate night when she had sent a message into the unknown. What might have happened if she had never taken that chance? What if humanity had decided the risk was too great or the cause was already lost? Then she would visit the training facilities where human instructors worked with coalition forces, and she would see Sergeant Seungri Oh. He was still serving despite losing his left arm to HFY artillery during the siege of Hill 247. He had adapted his fighting style, learned to use his remaining hand with incredible skill, and now spent his time teaching coalition Marines the tactics that had saved the galaxy. His favorite lesson always ended with the same simple motto that had become legendary across the Outer Rim, whispered by soldiers facing impossible odds on a dozen different worlds. We don't retreat. We don't surrender. We don't quit. The galaxy had learned to fear those words, and more importantly, it had learned to believe in them. The age of inevitable Kethavar expansion was over, replaced by a new era, where even the most powerful empires had to consider the possibility that somewhere out there was an enemy that simply refused to lose. The galaxy would never be quite the same, and that was exactly how humanity liked it.